Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to answer that musical question: are German conductors overrated? Well, the short answer is yes. Quite often they are. And the reason, of course, is because German music is overrated. Well, that's not true. German music is not overrated. I just said that because I knew everybody's ears would perk up. No. The difference between one masterpiece and another masterpiece is of a kind in which comparisons are irrelevant. So the great works of German music are masterpieces, and you can't possibly overrate them unless you start claiming that they're greater than the masterpieces of not German music, which is a nonsensical comparison to make. I do believe that in general our musical culture suffers from an over-reverence for the classics. Just that limited canon of things. And I think that over-reverence is actually getting worse as it affects our concert life. Not so much on discs, with wonderful people who collect records like all of you folks, because you know just how much richer the discography is than we'll ever see live in concert. That's just a sorry fact of our musical life, at least as regards concert going. But it's a wonderful fact for those of us who like things besides the standard repertoire. It gives us plenty of options. So let's just say that. But there is a side effect, I think, a corollary or to the fact that we hold the German classics in such high regard. And that's obviously that the people who play them or claim to specialize in them kind of get the benefit of the doubt when it comes to our estimation of just how significant or important they are artistically or as compared to their colleagues. And I want to take a couple of examples and see, how they stack up when we consider what their relationship was to the German standard repertoire. Let's say right away, though, the reason that the German standard repertoire is such a big deal among conductors is that it was the German standard repertoire that effectively invented the conductor, the modern conductor. Before abstract orchestral music came along, and the masters who created abstract orchestral music, the conductor was an accompanist. 99% of what he did was either conduct operas or ballets or theatrical music or concertos in concerts. The stars were the singers, the stars were the solo instrumentalists. In some ways, they still are. Try going to see an all-orchestral concert with a conductor who isn't famous and no soloist, and try and sell out the hall. Things have not changed as much as we think they have. But when you make a symphony the major event of the day, we can today pack a hall for a Mahler symphony. At least in New York you can, and in a few other cities too. People turn out for it. And it has no soloist. It has nothing else. One of the reasons that Mahler symphonies have become so popular is because orchestras like to take them on tour because they're big and they're splashy, and you don't have to hire a soloist. You just rehearse the symphony. It makes life so much simpler. So we see how the German repertoire, this concept of the symphony as a major event, really created the modern conductor who was the star of the show. And so it's no wonder that conductors love that music, and it's no wonder that those of us who love that music tend to admire vastly the conductors who play it best. There's a reason for all of this. I'm not trying to be snarky or critical. I want us all to understand what happened. But as a result of that, strange things have happened to our evaluation of certain artists. Now, let's take the iconic example of all of this, and that, of course, is Willy Furtwängler. Furtwängler was a conductor of such limited repertoire and ability that had he not been conducting German music, nobody would have paid attention to him. Can you imagine if his mastery was in Rimsky-Korsakov? Would anybody care? Of course not. Naturally not. Furtwängler was so limited, he didn't even record a complete Beethoven cycle. There's a live one, I know, the Second Symphony, but basically, he only did major masterpieces. He couldn't really conduct classical repertoires. Mozart and Haydn were incredibly limited. What do you have? One Haydn symphony, couple Mozart thingies. That's it. He did some good opera house conducting. He could. His Wagner, of course, was splendid. But essentially, he focused only on that limited number of German symphonic masterpieces on which he built his career. I don't think it's enough. I don't think it's enough to say that he had any significant greatness in him at all beyond that stuff, especially since, as often as not, he couldn't even do that well, particularly well. But posterity has decided that because he did it, and because he made it sound so difficult while doing it, there must have been something mystical and spiritual and fabulous and amazing about the man. And when he was on, there was something magical and mystical and fabulous and spiritual about the man. There really could be. I mean, he could give incandescent performances of the half a dozen or a dozen works that he really focused on. And they were all standard German repertoire. And that is an extreme case. But it's an extreme case that I think proves the point, because you can't imagine him doing that in any other repertoire. I mean, if you heard his Ravel or his Sibelius, the limited things he did outside of that Fach were largely just appalling. Absolutely appalling. I mean, can you imagine him making a career in contemporary music? Wasn't going to happen. No way was it going to happen. So Fort Wengler is one case. At the opposite end, and just as fascinating, is the case of Herbert von Karajan, the anti-Fort Wengler. I like to think that the Berlin Philharmonic finally chose Karajan as its music director because they wanted to play together and in tune at some point in their lives. I mean, it was a helpful thing. But Karajan was just the opposite. Karajan's forte, his Fach, was not in the standard German repertoire. We all know the things that he did great. Shostakovich 10, Prokofiev 5, the Second Viennese School. He was a fabulous Puccini conductor. Amazing, wonderful opera conductor. He did good Wagner too. His Richard Strauss was sensational, but Richard Strauss is not a German symphonist. I mean, he's not really part of that immortal classic school of German music in the same way that, like, Beethoven and Brahms were. And so Karajan was so desperate, so insecure about his role as the avatar of all things Germanic that he couldn't stop making recordings of the Beethoven and Brahms symphonies as his career went on, even though there was no difference between them from one performance to the next. Karajan's approach barely changed at all. I mean, sure, from one of his 20 recordings of Beethoven's Seventh, he'll add a repeat or drop a repeat, or one may be a little faster or a little slower. But conceptually, on the whole, the differences are not significant. They really aren't. They weren't with Fort Wengler either. His conception of a piece basically stayed fixed throughout his entire career. I mean, Toscanini was vastly more variable from one performance to the next than either Karajan or Fort Wengler were. He had a much more probing curiosity about how to conduct the music and what it meant and what he could do with it. I mean, he was much more interesting that way than either of those two German guys were. And that's a demonstrable fact. You just listen to the records and they speak for themselves. But Karajan's greatest record may be Honegger's Third Symphony, and he was not going to go to his grave as the world's greatest Honegger conductor. You can be sure of that. And actually, I think the symphonies he recorded as frequently as Beethoven's were the last three of Tchaikovsky. He did those 3 or 4 or 5 times each too, and very well, I might add. I think his Tchaikovsky was on the whole more persuasive than a lot of his Beethoven. And sometimes he did really good Beethoven, and sometimes he did really good Brahms. But there's a difference between doing those pieces well and making a career as the guy who did them well. Karajan, for all of his desperate efforts, never quite, I think, was viewed as the ultimate conductor of the German standard repertoire. And I think that's probably because his own concept of orchestral sonority was in some ways rather inconsistent with what those German composers were doing. I mean, you cannot play Beethoven if you hate your woodwind section. It's just not going to work. It's not going to go very well. You can't do Beethoven's Ninth if you don't want to hear the chorus. You have to. So he was, eventually I think his egomania got in the way of his Germanophilia. Let's put it that way. So that's Karajan. Now let's look at someone else like Leonard Bernstein. He's an interesting case, isn't he? Now, he already recorded a Beethoven symphony early in his career, but that wasn't what he was known for. I mean, he was known, first of all, for being an American and for doing his own music and for doing Copland and Gershwin and, all the fun, sort of listenable 20th century stuff. He was never known for Brahms, although his earlier Brahms cycle is pretty good. The later one is, And his early Beethoven cycle, it got a lot of attention. Lots of people listened to it. Lots of people bought it. He talked about it on television. But no one really took him seriously as a Beethoven conductor, however good it was. And he was a great Beethoven conductor. He really was a terrific Beethoven conductor. But when he moved to Deutsche Grammophon, do you remember his first major Deutsche Grammophon release was the complete Beethoven symphonies with that picture of him as a gray-haired, grand old man. And here he was, the Vienna Philharmonic, making his statement in the German standard rep. And oh, what a big deal it was. It didn't count that he was a fabulous Haydn conductor. I mean, it just didn't matter. But when he did that Beethoven cycle, all of a sudden people woke up and said, because I remember reading the reviews. I remember seeing people talk about it. It was like, oh my, here's Leonard Bernstein doing Beethoven. He has arrived. It gave his career a wholly different luster and patina, as if it needed one. But it's true. It really worked for him. Think also about Karl Böhm. Karl Böhm is really a fun case because he was the absolute epitome of the cranky old kraut German Kapellmeister type guy. He was a wonderful conductor, don't get me wrong, but he could be awfully stodgy now and again. But what's really funny about Karl Böhm isn't that he specialized in that German repertoire like they all did. The folks of that era. He was really the last of an era, I think, of that kind of conductor. And I remember so vividly an interview with him where he talked about how exciting it was that finally in his 80s, he was recording the last 3 Tchaikovsky symphonies with the London Symphony Orchestra. Remember those? And remember how stodgy they were. Holy cow. But he loved them. He loved them. For him, it was like musical pornography. He felt like he was having such a prurient moment playing this rich, yummy, non-German, melodic, gloriously scored Russian music. Hilarious, absolutely hilarious, especially given his love of Richard Strauss. It's just amazing, absolutely amazing. In fact, there is a phenomenon that in old age, it's to his credit that in old age he picked up Tchaikovsky, by the way, because most of the time it works the other way around, right? Günter Wahn, George Sell, the conductors who in their later years really started to focus more and more intently on just the core classics because that's what they thought was the greatest music. And so that's what they did. And again, it's a self-reinforcing cycle, isn't it? I mean, a self-fulfilling prophecy. We think the music is the best. They think the music is the best. They sort of ostentatiously give up doing everything else but that as they get older and older and slower and heavier and darker. And, it's an old story. But it's one of the reasons that I think German conductors are born with a silver spoon in their mouth, with a certain advantage over conductors of other types. Because think of all the great conductors, really great conductors of other kinds, who are neglected or who are undervalued because they were not big conductors in the German repertoire. I mean, one of the most obvious ones that I can think of was Jean Martinon. I mean, Martinon was an amazing conductor by any standard, a completely fabulous artist who did tons and tons and tons of lesser known repertoire or French repertoire. He had his real gift was in playing 20th century French music. Does anybody care about 20th century French music? Well, they should. And the reason they should is because there's a lot of really great 20th century French music, including symphonies, and there aren't a lot of really great 20th century German symphonies. They just don't exist. Germany sort of wrote itself out around the turn of the century, at least as far as symphonies go, whereas the French and the Americans and the British and even the Russians were all just getting going. And the Danish and the Finnish and everywhere else, symphonies were flourishing, but not in Germany. So it would really be a good thing to pay attention to some of the people who were extraordinary in playing that symphonic music. It may be that that symphonic music obviously builds on the German tradition. Of course it does. There's no question about that. But the fact of the matter is that the conductors who do it and who do it fantastically aren't going to get a lot of cred. And that isn't fair. One of the truly great conductors today is Esa-Pekka Salonen. As a conductor-composer, he's an extraordinary musician. His recordings with the LA Phil, that Sony box, are almost uniformly excellent. And he doesn't generally do Beethoven. Pierre Boulez was one of the exceptions who I think proved the rule. You know, he was a conductor who was enormously well respected and sought after, despite the fact that he did not do Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven predominantly. He did the more listenable, for the most part, 20th century stuff. And everybody gets to be one of them. You know, you get one of each type. And he was that type. I don't think he was the best of that type. I think there were many finer conductors out there. I mean, Salonen was clearly one of them. David Robertson is probably another. There are those who were doing contemporary stuff and who did it, you know, even better than Boulez did, I think. But he was the guy who got the attention because he was the guy who had the political weight behind him. He was the guy who had the entire budget of the French musical, cultural, whatever government behind everything that he did. And so he was able to get the attention and the power and the clout and make a name for himself. But when you think about it, you think about Paul Paret, and you think about Martinon, and you think about even Charles Munch, you know, who never completed a Beethoven cycle. Kind of shocking, isn't it? But was known more for his Berlioz, even though his favorite composer was Bach. Or look at Igor Markevich, who was amazing at everything. And we're talking a lot about him in the past few days with the Markevich boxes coming. And he was amazing. And his Beethoven was amazing. Absolutely fabulous. So was Ferenc Fricsay. His Beethoven was amazing. But he was known for Hungarian music. The pigeonholing of conductors leads to, I believe, their being undervalued because we don't value the music similarly. And we should. And we should. As I said, a masterpiece is a masterpiece. It doesn't matter what kind of masterpiece it is. And, you know, finally, I just want to address a fascinating contemporary case of, you know, the German school's maybe last gasp, if we're lucky, Christian Thielemann. Christian Thielemann is trying to be, you know, the modern answer to somebody like Furtwängler. He limits himself to only the German standard repertoire, at least for the most part. He's not an opportunist like, you know, Roger Norrington or Theodor Kurensis, you know, who are trying to, you know, establish their claims to sublimity and profundity by messing with Beethoven. That's not what Thielemann does. Thielemann is trying to be the natural Urdeutsch. And, oh, is it not working? My God, his Beethoven was dreadful. His Richard Strauss was dreadful. He's not a bad opera conductor sometimes. He can accompany pretty well. But by and large, his Schumann symphonies, except for the second, but by and large, I don't think people are buying it anymore. At least they're not buying it outside of Germany. and Vienna, outside of the German-speaking world. I mean, I'll have a lot of friends in Germany who aren't buying it either. But in terms of his obvious career and where he conducts and what he conducts, there's still an audience for that. It's still a local audience. But there isn't the international audience that there used to be. I think that that's a very, very interesting fact, because when we started this conversation, we were talking about a tradition that began its life as a local tradition, and it seems that to there it must return if that's what conductors want to try and do. If they think that they're going to be the great avatars of German symphonism and German orchestral music, then they're going to have to stay in Germany to do it, because I don't think anybody else is going to put up with it. And that, I think, is just a wonderful thing. Absolutely a wonderful thing. Of course, if Telemann were a great conductor of that repertoire, maybe we would be saying something different. But he isn't, so we don't have to worry about it. And those are my thoughts on this whole topic of whether or not German conductors are overrated, and the relationship between what they play and how much we credit them for playing it. So keep on listening, folks. I hope you enjoyed this little chat. Please feel free to weigh in. I want to hear what you think about it. Take care.